Good afternoon, church. Please allow me a couple of minutes to get some things out of the way right from the very beginning. I must take the time to thank the shepherd of this Zion, Pastor Lamar, for offering me this opportunity to come and stand before this sacred desk. It is humbling to stand with the cloud of witnesses who have stood here before me, and I take its significance not lightly. Thank you, sir. I also want to take a moment to thank the whole ministerial staff amongst us and all those who are coming through the Board of Examiners who have welcomed me into the fold and have supported my call and my emerging ministry. I am grateful. I'm also grateful for my Metropolitan AME family. You have created space for me and my husband within this historic Black church to join in the work of worship, liberation, and service. And we are so grateful that we stepped through that door on that very first day. If you'll indulge me just one more moment, I would like to thank my husband, Scott, who has now quit 2 jobs to follow where God has called me to be. With the patience of a saint, he supports all that I do and all that I am, and for that I could never be grateful enough. And now to God, who plucked me out of the muck and the mire and started me on my way. To God I give all the honor and the glory and the praise for doing within me what I could not do for myself, saving me for eternity by divine grace. You know we're down here, Lord, waiting on you, waiting on you, waiting on you. You know we're down here, Lord, waiting on you, and we can't do nothing till you come. You know we're down here, Lord, waiting on you, waiting on you. Waiting on you, you know we're down here, Lord, waiting on you, and we can't do nothing till you come. You know we're down here, Lord, waiting on you, yes, yes, waiting on you. You know we're down here, Lord, waiting on you. Can't do nothing till you come. Lord, you know we can't do nothing till you come. We're so grateful that by the time we get to this place, you are already here. So we ask with humble hearts and with open spirits that you would make your presence known in a miraculous way for us now. That you would remove all impediments that your word might come up against, even if it comes through me. Speak to us that we might live and that we might build your kingdom right here on earth, even right now. Amen. During this week, the first full week of the new president's administration, I heard a term for the very first time: hypothetical courage. Out of the mouth of a late-night reporter, the term hypothetical courage describes a person who talks a good game, even acts as if they're prepared to do something courageous, but then does not follow through when the time comes. This week, hypothetical courage was used to describe politicians who were opposed to nominees for the new cabinet, who deeply critiqued them to the press and on social media, who sharply questioned not only their ability but their credibility to lead the departments for which they had been nominated to lead. But when the time of decision came, they voted yes for the nominee to go forward. Now, let's be clear. These are not the only examples of hypothetical courage. Hypothetical courage. Courage that is only true in the hypothetical. Courage that is not really courage at all, but simply an act meant to make someone look good while they default on their commitments in the real world when it really matters, when lives are at stake. I want to posit this morning that in our current time, in our current space, in our current climate, and our current place, that God's got no time for hypothetical courage. The title of this sermon is God's Got No Time for Hypothetical Courage. I'm going to say it one more time if you want to share the space with me. God's got no time for hypothetical courage. If you'd like to turn with me to Exodus 1, chapter 1, we're going to begin with verse 8. If you're new to the Bible, if you start in the beginning, you get to the second book, that's Exodus. And when we say Exodus 1, we mean that we're going to start with chapter 1. So Exodus chapter 1, and we're going to begin with verse 8. Now a new king came to power in Egypt who did not know Joseph. He said to his people, the Israelite people are now larger in number and stronger than we are. Come on, let's be smart and deal with them. Otherwise, they will only grow in number. And if war breaks up, they will join our enemies, fight against us, and then escape from the land. As a result, the Egyptians put foremen of forced work gangs over the Israelites to harass them with hard work. They had to build storage cities named Pithom and Ramesses for Pharaoh. But the more they were oppressed, the more they grew and spread, so much so that the Egyptians started to look at the Israelites with disgust and dread. So the Egyptians enslaved the Israelites. They made their lives miserable with hard labor, making mortar and bricks, doing field work, and by forcing them to do all kinds of other cruel work. The king of Egypt spoke to two Hebrew midwives named Shiphrah and Puah. When you are helping the Hebrew women give birth and you see the baby being born, if it's a boy, kill him. But if it's a girl, you can let her live. Now the two midwives respected God, so they didn't obey the Egyptian king's order. Instead, they let the baby boys live. Instead, they let the baby boys live. Our text begins saying a king of Egypt came to power who did not know Joseph, meaning the Israelites had done well in Egypt when the people in power recognized the great works of Joseph and then extended that goodwill to his descendants. But the new king didn't care about all that. So he treated the Israelites with contempt because to him, they were just a bunch of foreigners taking up resources and creating a potential threat to him. In response, the state first placed the Israelites in what is translated as forced work gangs. When that didn't break their spirits or suppress their numbers, the state created a system of slavery to enslave the Israelites, making their lives miserable by forcing them to do all kinds of cruel work. Now, we may have heard the Exodus story before, and even for those who have been raised in the church, you might remember being taught about the burning bush. You might remember being taught about the showdown between Pharaoh and Yahweh with the 10 plagues, or even the splitting of the Red Sea. I mean, we've even got movie clips for that. But we might be harder pressed to think of a children's Sunday school lesson that teaches the specifics of verses 15 and 16. We often move right past these verses, but not today. The king of Egypt spoke to two Hebrew midwives named Shiphrah and Puah. When you are helping the Hebrew women give birth and you see the baby being born, if it is a boy, kill him, but if it is a girl, you can let her live. Before we start talking about the true courage of the two Hebrew midwives, we first need to talk about what necessitated their courage to begin with. In our text for today and throughout history, people in power have killed off their threats. Now he might have named it a Muslim ban, or he could have campaigned on a law and order platform, or he could have withheld access to healthy food or access to health care. But the king legalized a genocide to kill off the Israelite threat in 2 ways. Now, the first way seems pretty straightforward. By killing the boys, there will be no men to rise up against him. Now, while we might argue this today, back then it was thought that only men would be physically strong enough to mount a physical attack, or strategically smart enough to overthrow the empire. No boys, no men. No men, no threat. This is what's known as the first wave of genocide. But there is more. What continues the trauma is the second wave of genocide. After the first wave, after a whole generation of males is murdered, the remaining people live with the memories of losing their sons and their brothers, their potential husbands, uncles, or partners. As the older men die off and there are none to replace them, the empty spaces in living and working areas are constant reminders that the Egyptians have total control over the lives of the Israelites. And if they step out of line, they too can be eliminated. If they live, if they laugh, if they speak, if they succeed or survive in any way that can be seen as a threat, they too shall be murdered by the state, for there's no one left to save them, not their own men, and surely not the state. I came by here to tell somebody this morning that way back then, when the king of Egypt was looking to wipe out the Israelites with 2 full waves of genocide, God had no time for some hypothetical courage. There's a king who's so worried about holding on to power, he's willing to have infant baby boys killed. There's a whole race of people who have been enslaved and are watching their children being murdered by the state. Now, I'm not trying to speak for God, but I can be confident in this. God's not able to use folks with some hypothetical courage here. What's God gonna do with some hypothetical courage that postures for the camera, sounds good but does no good, makes people think that something's gonna get done but retreats in fear as soon as the decision needs to be made? No, I imagine God hearing the cries of his people, mothers, fathers, brothers, sisters, who have heard the rumors of the king's plan, down on their knees, probably lying flat on their faces, crying out to God in tears and wailing and gnashing of teeth, praying that their God will make some kind of way out of no way to save their people. I imagine God scanning the land of Egypt looking for some real courage and finding it in the way of Metropolitan African Methodist Episcopal Church, in the way of 2 Hebrew midwives. And that's when the story starts turning around. Verse 17 gives us a very different picture. After having received the order to kill off the baby boys, the midwives go a different route. We read, now the 2 midwives respected the Egyptian king's order. Instead, they let the baby boys live. I tried to imagine how the midwives must have felt. They, like other Hebrews, must have seen how the treatment of their people had gone from bad to worse over time, from brutal work camps to full enslavement, and now this directive from the king. There was no more dog whistle politics. Racism and xenophobia had been emboldened from above. The power of the Egyptian state had become so overwhelming it must have felt like there was nothing they could do. Who were they? They were lowly Hebrew midwives, women, older, with no status in society because they had no families of their own. And they're sent to help women deliver babies. Who were they to stand up to the unyielding power of the Egyptian king, who was afraid, felt vulnerable, and was ready to kill in order to eliminate any potential threat? I imagine after a lot of crying, praying, and brainstorming, they did the only thing they knew how to do, to obey God's command to protect life by helping those baby boys live. No one was going to tell them to participate in the state-ordered genocide of their people. No one was going to get them to act outside of themselves, to betray all that they believed in, to betray the one in whom they believed. They simply would not do it. These were women of God with true courage. The only kind of courage that can stand up to powers and principalities, death and destruction, crazy kings and racist regimes. God was looking for some true courage and found it in the way of two Hebrew midwives named Shiphrah and Puah. But after a period of time, even the Egyptian king started to figure out that the Hebrew boys were living beyond birth, and he confronts them. He's used to absolute obedience, and he doesn't understand how his command could have been misinterpreted or the absolutely unbelievable disobeyed directly. He challenges the midwives to explain what's going on. But these women, these Hebrew women of no standing, standing only with their true courage for protection, do not cower. Rather than bend to state-sponsored bullying, they lie to Pharaoh straight to his face, saying the Hebrew women aren't like the women of the empire. They are stronger, and by the time we get there, they have delivered the babies already. Now that's true courage. They lay their jobs and their lives and everything they know on the line. They do what they need to do. They do what they can do, and all the babies live, even in the midst of a genocide. And this morning, whether we need help figuring out how to summon true courage for the very first time, or we need encouragement after doing it for so long, I hear God speaking through the midwives with a couple of ways we can be strengthened for the journey. Number one, to serve with true courage. God doesn't ask us to do what we don't do. God asks us to do what we already do. I'm going to say that one more time. To serve with true courage. God doesn't ask us to do what we don't do, but we already do. The midwives can do two things: birthing babies to life and respecting God more than they fear the king of Egypt. They put these two things together, and that's how all the babies live. God never asks them to write scripture on a scroll, never calls them over to a burning bush, never commands them to join the army or overthrow a kingdom or be on the steward board or... The midwives do what they can do, what they already do, and God uses that. God needs a way to save newborn baby boys. Who better for the job than the midwives? Now, young people, do not feel like you've been left out, because God has given you gifts and skills even right now. And God can use true courage in you right now. Rather than all of us praying for new skills, new talents, or new funds, let us ask God how what we already know how to do can be used to save and transform this world. Point number one, to serve with true courage. God doesn't have to ask us to do what we don't do. God will only ask us to do what we already do. Number two, to serve with true courage, we need to work toward the future while acting in the now. The midwives were Hebrews too. They knew the messed up state of things. They, like other oppressed people, wanted just for their immediate situation to change, but for the unjust laws and policies to change too. But they didn't wait until all the slaves were liberated before they set out to save the baby boys from certain death. Like the midwives, we can take actions now that begin to break down injustice wherever it shows up. We may want to change the whole system of government, but we may have to register to vote. We may want different officials in office, but we may first have to actually vote. We may want to change the whole economic system, but we may first have to change our buying practices, our banking practices, our saving practices, our tithing practices, or our giving practices. Even right now, we resist, we march, we pray, we place pressure on the official. We, like the midwives, can pull the blinders off. It's always been this way. I guess it always has to be this way. Point number two, to serve with true courage, we need to work toward the future while acting in the now. Number three, to serve with true courage, we recognize that our oppression isn't the only oppression. Others need liberation too. In our text for today, the oppressed and enslaved people are most often referred to not as Israelites, but as Hebrews. The term Hebrew shows up in a lot of languages of biblical times and represents the same idea. People who are on the margins, have no voice and no land, and who are the most vulnerable victims of state power. While the Israelites make up part of the population that is being oppressed by the Egyptians, they are not the only population enslaved and abused by them. While Yahweh collects the descendants of Joseph, the whole Hebrew population is liberated too. In the midst of our own fights for liberation, we must not forget the ways in which others are in need of liberation. We will never be rich while others remain poor. We will never be safe while others remain in fear. And we will never be free while others remain in chains. We will never be human while other humans are treated inhumanely. Injustice works its very best self when it hurts someone so badly that they turn around and hurt others. When we take the Exodus text seriously, we must consider all of our modern-day Hebrew sisters and brothers who suffer, working together in mutual accountability to each other and resistance against evil in all of its forms. Point number 3, to serve with true courage, we must remember that ours isn't the only oppression. We need to remember the others who need liberation too. Okay, I'm a preacher, so I go through the numbers. I got 2 more. When we offer just a little bit of true courage, God creates a true miracle through us. Often we think of Exodus as a biblical book with rods that turn into snakes and rivers that turn to blood and seas that split because God says so. But the midwives are human agents of God's miracle of life even before any of those divine miracles happen. God doesn't split the Red Sea or turn a rod into a snake and back again or turn rivers into blood to get those baby boys born. God uses the creative courage, the fearless faithfulness, and the brilliant boldness of the midwives to outsmart the new king of Egypt. We don't participate in miracles because God cannot get it done. We participate in miracles because God gives us miracle-producing power. If a little bit of courage, God not only produces a miracle in the world, but produces it in and through us. We get to participate in God's kingdom-building, way-making, burden-bearing miracles in the world. If we are willing to offer even a little bit of courage, God creates a true miracle in us. And finally, we are able to have true courage because we serve the God of true courage. Unlike many of you, I am not raising any children. So I don't know what it's like to be responsible for the well-being of any child, let alone a child of color in the 21st century. Even though I know what it's like for my heart to break every time I see the kids in my neighborhood or the youth in this church who look just like the young children who've been gunned down by racist police and racial violence, I do not know what it's like to hope and pray and wonder and worry about the future, the tomorrow, and the todays of boys and girls for whom I am not totally responsible. But I know a God who does. In the book of Matthew, just like in the Exodus story, there too was a king worried about a threat. A king who would rise up and proclaim a kingdom greater than all kingdoms. And so when Jesus was born and the star rose into the sky, the king set the wise men out to find that baby, to bring his location back to him so the king could kill off his threat. But the wise men realized something was different with this baby who would be king and went back a different way. But the king believed he couldn't live with this threat, so he put forth a decree to go after all of the baby boys who were under 2 years old. This is known as the slaughter of the innocents. God's only begotten Son was born in a time when the state-sponsored genocide was right at him. And because God's only begotten Son was fully human and fully God, God knows what it's like to be targeted by state-sponsored genocide too. And thanks be to God that Jesus wasn't fronting some hypothetical courage. Thanks be to God that Jesus wasn't showing off for the cameras, trying to look good without any possibility of doing good, saying what was needed for popularity but could never help the people, talking a good game when the cross was somebody else's problem. God didn't say, well, there's a state-sponsored genocide going on right now, so maybe I'll come another day. No, we serve a God of true courage. And that's why point number 5, we are able to have true courage because we have been created in the image of the God of true courage. Make no mistake, God has no time for courage. But with God and in God and because of God, we can serve with true courage in a world that doesn't always make it easy to do so. All God is asking for, all God is searching for, all God is desperate for is a glimpse of true courage, that the God of true courage will enlarge and shape and use to create a miracle in the world right now. Let's make no mistake, hypothetical courage is the same kind of courage that allows white people who look like me to read Martin Luther King's letter, disparage the white people of the 60s in their silence, and then turn around and be just as silent today. Let's make no mistake, hypothetical courage allows for rich people to believe that poor people are just less responsible, less hardworking, and less capable of a good education or values. Hypothetical courage is incapable of resisting a fascist regime, protecting our Muslim and our Latinx sisters and brothers, or ensuring health care for everyone, eliminating food deserts, or insisting that every single human being, no matter who they are or who they love, is worthy of dignity and safety and respect. Metropolitan AME, we are the courage DC needs right now. Metropolitan AME, we are the courage that the AME Church needs right now. Metropolitan AME, we are the courage that our schools and our families and our friends and our neighbors and our politicians need right now. We are the courage that the lonely and the forgotten and the widows and the gangbangers and the foster kids and the prisoners and the homeless need right now. Metropolitan, we are the ones that God needs right now. The God who sits high and looks low. The God who makes a way out of no way. Who created the heavens and the earth out of chaos. Who looks out for the vulnerable and tears down oppression. Whose mercy and grace could transform the hardest of hearts and heal the deepest of wounds. Who is creating a kingdom where the most powerful lion is friends with the most vulnerable lamb. And the God who could not be stopped by cross, death, or grave. And who lives and reigns forever and ever. And whose power and might bring life and life abundantly. Make no mistake. Let's make no mistake, Metropolitan. God's got no time for some hypothetical courage. God's looking for even a small ounce of true courage, and he's waiting to see it again and 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 again. What of Metropolitan, all the mothers and the fathers and the babies and the teens and the stewards and the trustees, all the high school students and the teachers, all the retirees and the unemployed, all the preachers and the choir members and the ushers and the musicians and the breakfast committees and the cleaners, all the founding members and the folk just found their way in here today? What if we pulled all of our courage together and offered it up to the God who can make true miracles out of it? My Metropolitan family and all who can hear the sound of my voice, God's looking for some true courage. And with it, we could be the miracle that the world is waiting for. Amen.